In 1356, a king knelt in the mud of a field near Poitiers and handed over his sword. Not to another king, to a prince's soldiers, who now owned him. Because a captured king wasn't a prisoner, he was a receipt. And the number on that receipt, 3 million gold coins, was large enough to bend the budget of a nation for a generation. This war didn't just take lives, it priced them. Here is the story you were probably told about how that king ended up in the mud. Two crowns, England and France, locked in a blood feud over who had the rightful claim to the French throne. 100 years of it. Generation after generation of proud, violent men who could not let a grudge die, knights so drunk on honor, kings so consumed by dynasty that they bled two nations white for a chair. In that version, the length of the war is a moral fact. It lasted a century because these were savage, backward people who simply loved to fight. There is one small detail that version cannot explain. When you win a medieval battle, you do not, as a rule, kill the wealthy men on the other side. You catch them. Carefully. You keep them alive, well-fed, and comfortable, sometimes for years. A hatred that burns for 100 years does not, at the decisive moment, gently take the enemy prisoner and send home for a good bottle of wine. That is not what rage does. That is what a business does. So let's put the hatred down for a moment, because it explains almost nothing. The 100 Years' War did not last 100 years because two peoples couldn't stop hating each other. It lasted because, for a large and powerful group of men on both sides, the war was not a catastrophe to be survived. It was an income to be protected. Call it the century that ran on ransom. Once you see that, the shape of the whole thing changes. The strange decisions stop looking like madness and start looking like accounting. Why prisoners were treasured instead of killed. Why armies marched out of their way to burn farms they had no intention of holding. Why a war, supposedly about a French throne, bankrupted Italian banks and reorganized the English parliament. And, in the end, why a war that hatred could not stop was finally stopped. Not by a peace, not by exhaustion, not by forgiveness, but by a change in how one side collected its taxes. Here is the through line, and I'll say it plainly so you can hold on to it. A profitable war does not end itself. Somebody has to make it unprofitable. And the way that finally happened built a machine that is still running today, one you fund. Quietly, every single year. We're going to follow the money through this war in layers. First, who got paid and how. Then, who paid them and what it cost the men doing the lending. Then, the road not taken, the version of Europe that this arrangement quietly killed. And finally, the thing that ended the war, which turns out to be the same thing that ended the world the war belonged to. After you see the arithmetic, everything else about this period stops sounding like character and starts sounding like consequence. Start on the ground, with a single man-at-arms, after a battle in northern France in the middle of the 14th century. He is standing over an enemy who has just yielded. And the question in his head is not really, should this man live or die? It is closer to, what is this man worth? And to whom? Because in this economy, a defeated enemy is not a corpse to be made. He is an asset to be assessed. A common foot soldier is worth little. You might let him go, or not bother. But an armored man on a good horse that is a nobleman, and a nobleman has family, land, and a lord, all of whom can be made to pay for his return, so you don't kill him. You take his gauntlet, you take his word, and you take him home, where he becomes, for as long as it takes to raise the money, a line item in your household accounts, a guest, a hostage, a payment plan wearing spurs. Now scale that instinct all the way up, past the knights, past the barons, to the very top. In 1356, at that field near Poitiers, an English force led by the Black Prince captured the King of France himself, John II, and here the logic reaches its absurd and perfect conclusion. The most valuable prisoner in Europe generated the largest price tag in Europe. His ransom, set in the Treaty of Brétigny in 1360, was 3 million gold écus. I want that number to stay abstract for exactly one more second, and then I want to make it concrete. 3 million gold coins is not a fine. It is a substantial fraction of everything the French crown could scrape together in a year, demanded all at once, for one man's body. To even begin his release, hundreds of thousands had to be found up front, and when the cash fell short, his own sons were handed to the English as living collateral, to sit in captivity in place of the coins. A nation mortgaged its princes to buy back its king. That is not the ledger of a grudge. That is a hostage market with a throne at the top of the price list. And this is the constraint underneath the entire war, the physical fact everything else grows out of. For the men who actually did the fighting, the nobles, and the increasingly professional soldiers, revenue did not come from winning the war in any strategic sense. It came from ransom and plunder. Victory in a campaign was abstract and belonged to kings. A captured baron was cash, and belonged to you. The reward system was wired directly to capture and pillage, and only very loosely, if at all, to actually ending the thing. Sit with what that means. The people who decided, year after year, whether the war would continue, were very often the same people who were paid when it did. A profitable war does not end itself. Once the reward is wired to capture rather than to peace, the war develops something close to a metabolism. It feeds itself. Watch how it changes the behavior of the men inside it. A knight's calculation on the battlefield is not purely about survival or glory. It now runs through a kind of appraisal. Kill the poor, ransom the rich. There are documented moments in this war where that arithmetic breaks down under pressure, at Agincourt in 1415. With too many prisoners and too few men to hold them safely, the order came to kill French captives, and men hesitated. Some historians read that hesitation as chivalry. Read it also as accountants, watching their profit margin bleed out in the mud. Both things can be true. That is the point. The honor and the invoice were braided together so tightly that even the men living it could not always tell them apart. Now, zoom out from the single knight to the whole apparatus. Because the metabolism scales. War in this period was increasingly fought not by a king's loyal vassals turning up out of duty, but by men under contract, indentured captains raising companies for pay, keeping a share of ransoms and loot as the real return on the venture. When the official war paused, these companies did not politely dissolve and go home. There was nothing to go home to that paid this well. They became the routiers, the free companies' armed businesses roaming France, extracting protection money from terrified towns, selling their services to whoever was buying. The war had produced a standing population of men whose entire livelihood was violence, and who had no economic reason to want it to end. And when the fighting formally paused, that fact became impossible to hide. After the Treaty of Brétigny brought a truce in 1360, thousands of these now unemployed soldiers did not disband. They coalesced into what contemporaries called the Great Company, a roving army of the jobless, and spent the peace pillaging France as methodically as any campaign. Peace, it turned out, was just unpaid war. The men the fighting had manufactured still had to eat, and they knew exactly one trade. And underneath the soldiers, the people actually paying for all of it were breaking. In 1358, in the countryside north of Paris, crushed between the taxes raised to ransom, a captured king, and the companies burning and extorting at will, the peasants rose in a furious, doomed revolt we now call the Jacquerie. It was put down with a savagery that dwarfed anything it had done. Read it not as random peasant fury, but as a balance sheet failing from below. The people who were the tax base could only be squeezed so far before something tore. And then there is the single most misunderstood tactic of the war, the one that finally shows you the whole machine at once, the chevauchée. Over and over, English armies marched deep into French territory and did not seek battle at all. They burned. Crops, villages, mills, barns, a wide corridor of destruction cut through the countryside, and then they left. To modern eyes, it looks like pure sadism. Savagery for its own sake. Exactly the backward and brutal story we started with. It isn't. It is one of the coldest financial instruments of the entire war. A medieval king's power rested on the taxable wealth of his land, the peasants working it, the harvests, the markets. Burn the countryside, and you are not just being cruel. You are attacking the enemy king's balance sheet directly. You are destroying his tax base, his ability to pay his own soldiers, his credibility as a protector. And here is the brutal efficiency of it. Wrecking a rival's revenue was far cheaper, and far safer, than trying to defeat his army in a pitched battle you might lose. The chevauchée is not rage. It is a hostile act against a treasury, carried out with fire because fire was the available technology. The suffering was real, and it was enormous, and it was a means to a fiscal end. So the war can pay its soldiers from the inside, through ransom and plunder. But that only covers the men at the sharp end. Kings still had to fund the whole enormous enterprise, the ships, the wages, the sieges, the alliances, and neither crown was remotely rich enough to do that from its own lands. This is where the war forces something new into existence. Not weapons, but financial machinery. Substitute engines for money the kings did not have. England built its engine out of sheep. The one thing England produced that all of Europe desperately wanted was wool. Fine, valuable wool that fed the looms of Flanders and Italy. So the crown did the obvious thing. It taxed the one export everyone needed. In the 1330s, As the war began, Edward III drove wool export duties up roughly sixfold, and the money that came back is genuinely staggering for the age. At its peak in the early 1350s, the customs and subsidies on wool were bringing the crown well over £100,000 in a single year, in a world where £1,000 a year was enough to sustain an earl in full aristocratic splendor. By the reign of Henry V, something on the order of 60% of the entire royal income was coming off the back of the wool trade. An English king went to war in France, and the war was paid for by the fleece on English hills. And to make that revenue easier to control, the crown eventually funneled almost all wool exports through a single point, the port of Calais, from 1363, where every sack could be counted, inspected, and taxed on its way out of the kingdom. Centralize the trade, and you centralize the tax. It is a very old insight, and this war taught it hard. Money is easiest to take where it is forced to pass through a gate you own. But taxes come in slowly, and wars demand cash now. So the crown borrowed against the future, against next year's wool, from the most sophisticated lenders alive, the great banking houses of Florence, the Bardi, and the Peruzzi. They advanced enormous sums to Edward III, betting on a quick, glorious, profitable war. It was not quick. And around the early 1340s, with victory nowhere in sight and the debts monstrous, the king did the thing sovereigns do when the numbers stopped working. He stopped paying. The estimates historians work with are sobering, on the order of 900,000 florins owed to the Bardi, 600,000 to the Peruzzi, figures that are debated but agreed to be vast. None of it came back the way it was owed. And here the war reaches across the Alps and touches something the two kings never intended. The Peruzzi collapsed. The Bardi followed within a few years. These were not corner moneylenders. They were among the largest financial institutions in Europe, holding the deposits of merchants and nobles across Italy. When they fell, the loss rippled outward through the whole Italian credit world. A war about a French throne had just helped detonate the financial capital of the continent. That is what a war running on credit looks like when the credit runs out. France, meanwhile, was building a different engine, and it is the one that matters most, because it never got switched off. To pay for a war that would not end, the French crown began reaching for taxes it could collect regularly, as a matter of routine, without going cap in hand to beg permission for each one. A tax on salt, the gabelle, which reached into something every single person needed simply to keep food through winter. Taxes on the sale of goods, the aides. And above all, a direct levy on households, the taille, that could just be imposed. Salt is the tell. You do not tax salt to hurt an enemy across the channel. You tax salt because everyone, in every village, in every year, must buy it, which makes it the perfect base for a tax you intend to collect forever. Each of these was sold as an emergency measure, a temporary sacrifice for the duration of the war. Hold that word temporary. We are watching, in real time and under cover of a national emergency, the birth of the permanent tax. Here is where I have to be careful and honest, because this next part is where the two countries quietly split onto different roads, and only one of those roads was inevitable. When a medieval king needed extraordinary money, the old logic said he had to ask. He had to summon the people who had it, the nobles, the clergy, the towns, into an assembly, make his case, and get their consent. Consent was leverage. Every time the king came asking, the people asked to pay had a chance to say, yes, but first, address our grievances. Yes, but you will account for how it's spent. That negotiation, repeated over decades, is one of the ways a society grows a spine, an institution that can check the crown. In England, the war fed exactly that. Because the king so constantly, so desperately needed money for France, and because so much of it ran through the wool trade, Parliament got its hands on the tap. Granting the wool subsidy became something Parliament did, conditionally, in exchange for a hearing of its own demands. War made the English crown need its parliament, and a needed institution is a powerful one. The habit of no taxation without our say was, in part, hammered out on the anvil of this war. France had the same raw materials. It had the Estates General, an assembly that could, in principle, have done what the English Parliament did, traded consent for power, and grown into a permanent check on the king. And at moments during the darkest years, especially after Poitiers when the captured king's ransom had to be found, it very nearly did. Reformers pushed hard to make royal taxation answerable to the assembly. For a moment it looked real, with John II, a prisoner in England, and the government in the shaky hands of his young son. The Estates General that met in Paris in the late 1350s pressed its advantage hard. Led by the Parisian merchant Etienne Marcel, the reformers extracted, in 1357, a sweeping ordinance meant to bind the crown, taxation overseen by the assembly, the money accounted for, royal officials made answerable. For a breath, France stood exactly where England was standing, at the door of a government that had to ask. Then it came apart. In the chaos of the Jacquerie, Marcel's killing in 1358, and the recovery of a monarchy that had learned one lesson above all others: never again let survival depend on an assembly's yes. Historians still debate how close it truly came, but the door stood open, and then it was shut. It didn't hold. And the reason it didn't is the quiet tragedy buried in this war's finances. Because the French crown found a way to make taxation permanent, to collect year after year without returning to ask, the leverage evaporated. If the king never has to come asking, the assembly he would have asked never gains the power to say no. The Estates General withered into something advisory, something that met rarely and mattered less each time. The very success of France's war financing strangled, in its cradle, the institution that might have checked the French monarchy. The road toward representative government did not fail in France because the French were unsuited to it. It was closed off by a fiscal solution that worked too well. Now go back and pick up everything we started with, the whole story of proud, savage, honor-mad men fighting for a century over a throne, and let's rewrite each piece as the downstream of an invoice. Chivalry, the elaborate code of mercy toward a beaten enemy, the sparing and the ceremony. We are taught it as the moral flower of the warrior class, honor made visible. Look again. Chivalry, in its hardest edge, is the etiquette of a hostage market. You spare the noble, because a live noble is money and a dead one is nothing. The rules about how to treat a captured knight are not only a code of honor, they are, underneath, the terms and conditions of a ransom industry, dressed in the language of virtue. The mercy was real. It was also priced. Knightly honor, the horror of refusing a fight, the compulsion to meet the enemy in the open. Partly a genuine value, yes, but it lived inside men whose entire path to wealth ran through battle, through the capture that made them rich. The culture told them war was noble. The economics told them war was lucrative. Those two voices were saying the same thing, and it is very hard to hear where one stops and the other begins. The brutality against the common people, the burned villages, the chevauchée we already dismantled, told as savagery. Revealed as balance sheet warfare, an attack on a rival's revenue with the cheapest weapon available. And the endless dynastic quarrel itself, the war for the throne. The throne was the reason everyone could say out loud. But a throne is also the ultimate revenue-generating asset, and around the claim to it clustered thousands of men for whom the fighting, not the throne, was the point. Now, and this is the part I refuse to let slide, because the easy version of this argument is a lie of its own. It would be too neat to say these men were only greedy, that honor was a costume and money was the truth underneath. That is just character-based history flipped upside down. It flattens the same way, only cynically. The constraint decides what is possible. It does not decide what each man does inside what's possible. Plenty of knights genuinely believed the code they profited from. Plenty of kings wanted the crown for reasons that had nothing to do with a ledger. The economics set the shape of the board. It made war a game that paid, and so a game that would be played for a very long time. Within that shape, human beings still chose, still betrayed and spared, and sacrificed for reasons that were entirely their own. What the money explains is not every choice. It explains why the war could go on, choosing to continue for 100 years. A profitable war does not end itself, but the men inside it were never only wallets. So what finally ended it? Not a change of heart. A change of arithmetic, two of them, arriving together. The first was fiscal. In 1439, the French crown made its direct tax, the taille, permanent, a standing source of money the king could collect every year without asking anyone. And with that reliable river of cash, Charles VII did something new in 1445. He built a standing army. The Compagnies d'ordonnance companies of professional soldiers on the royal payroll, paid regularly by the treasury rather than by whatever they could loot or ransom. Roughly 9,000 men who worked for the state. Notice what that quietly kills. When soldiers are paid a dependable wage, the ransom and plunder economy stops being the engine of the army and becomes a nuisance to it. Regularly paid troops loot less and answer to the king rather than to the profit motive. The state was, for the first time, buying the loyalty the old economy used to rent out. It also, at last, solved the free company problem. Men who had spent decades as freelance violence were either absorbed into the payroll or hunted down by it. The crown didn't moralize the soldiers out of existence. It hired the ones it wanted and destroyed the ones it didn't. A monopoly on force is built exactly this way, not by ending violence, but by owning it. The second change was made of gunpowder. Over the same years, French artillery under the Bureau brothers became the best in Europe. And at Castillon, in July of 1453, they used it. The English army threw itself at a fortified French camp bristling with something like 300 guns, and it was slaughtered thousands of English dead against a French loss counted in the low hundreds. Their great commander Talbot died there, and with that, the war simply ended. England was left holding a single town. Look at what the cannon did to our whole story. The knight, the armored, ransomable, immensely valuable body that the entire war economy was built to capture alive a cannonball, does not care about any of that. It does not take him prisoner. It does not assess his family's wealth. It turns the most expensive asset on the battlefield into just another corpse. The gun made the ransom worthless. It broke the machine. And I want to be clear-eyed about this, because it is tempting to call this progress. It was not moral progress. Nobody at Castillon was kinder. What happened is that the state acquired two things at once, a permanent income and a monopoly on organized, industrial-scale violence. The war didn't end because people became good. It ended because the state became strong enough to no longer need the war to be profitable. Strip away the armor and the fleur-de-lis, and the thing you are looking at has a shape you already know. This is a burn rate problem. It is the oldest problem in the financing of any prolonged war. Expenditure that runs far ahead of income, plugged with borrowing, until the borrowing itself becomes the crisis. Edward III's default on the Florentine banks is recognizably the same event as a modern sovereign debt crisis, a state that spent on a war against a stream of revenue that never arrived and took its creditors down with it when it fell. But I have to mark exactly where that comparison breaks, because if I let it run too far, it turns into a lie. Edward III had no bond market, no central bank, no institutional machinery for managing state debt across generations. When he defaulted, he simply stopped paying specific families, and those families were personally destroyed. A modern state defaults into a vast, impersonal financial system built precisely to absorb and reprice that risk. The medieval king's debt was a personal promise that could be personally broken. Ours is an institution. The resemblance is in the shape of the problem money spent faster than it comes in, not in the machinery for surviving it. Do not walk away thinking a 14th century king was basically a modern treasury. He was a man who owed other men money and chose to ruin them. There is a second shape here, and this one points straight at your own life. The permanent tax born to fund an endless medieval war is the direct ancestor of a pattern every modern state repeats. The emergency levy that never leaves. Income tax, in more than one modern country, began as a temporary wartime measure, and simply stayed. The mechanism is identical. A crisis lowers people's resistance to a new tax, the tax is framed as just for the duration, and then the duration quietly becomes forever. But here too, mark the break, because it is the most important line in this whole story. A medieval French subject had no vote, no ballot with which to ever repeal the thing. The machinery of consent we now take for granted is the exact thing this war, in France, helped strangle in its cradle. So let the resemblance unsettle you, but remember that you were handed the one tool the 14th century French were quietly denied. So hold the two truths together, because the honest version needs both. The constraint was real. War in this age genuinely could pay for itself. And that fact gave the fighting a life far longer than any grudge could sustain. And also, inside that constraint, real people made real choices to spare, to burn, to lend, to default, to reform, and those choices were their own. But here is what outlasted all of them. Every knight who got rich on ransoms is dust. Every banker the war ruined is dust. The kings, the claim to the throne, the whole blood and honor story dust. What the war actually built, the thing that survived it, was the tax. France ended that century with a permanent, routine, unasked-for levy on its people and a standing army to enforce the peace, the working skeleton of the modern state. The war produced no lasting winner on the battlefield. It produced a permanent tax and a government strong enough to collect it forever. That is the strange inheritance. We remember the 100 Years' War for the archers at Agincourt and a captured king in the mud. But the piece of it that reached all the way to you isn't the glory or the ransom. It's the quiet machinery of a state that learned it could simply take every year, without asking, and never unlearned it. Which raises the next uncomfortable question, and it's the one I want to leave you with. If a permanent tax was the real product of this war, then the deepest constraint was never the throne at all. It was this: A medieval king could not build a modern state until he found a way to make his people pay without their consent. So next time, we follow that exact thread into the thing that consent problem eventually detonated the moment, centuries later, when a people finally sent the bill back.